something shifted in the mechanics of global mobility, quietly but decisively. For decades, the foundational consensus of the international economic order was built on the fluid movement of human capital across borders, a borderless talent pipeline that filled structural deficits in the developed world. That consensus is dead. A systemic reversal is underway, structured not by gradual cultural shifts, but by administrative finality. A sudden knock on the door, an unexpected official letter, an absolute deadline that leaves no room for appeal. Governments are enacting restrictions, executing large-scale removals, and deploying aggressive border enforcement mechanisms at a scale that breaks with 50 years of post-war policy. This is not a collection of isolated national reactions to local politics. It is a synchronized global recalibration. To understand the baseline from which the world is departing, one must examine the era that built modern globalized labor markets. Since the late 20th century, advanced economies operated under an implicit bargain. Capital and labor flowed toward efficiency. A complex infrastructure of temporary work permits, student pathways, and asylum frameworks existed to manage but ultimately facilitate this flow. National borders became economic valves, adjusted to meet the demands of corporate expansion, demographic aging, and agricultural necessity. The baseline assumption was permanence through integration. A temporary visa was widely understood as a preliminary step toward long-term residency. But the physical reality of 2026 tells a fundamentally different story. In major transit hubs, urban centers, and border provinces across multiple continents, the indicators of this old baseline are rapidly vanishing. Walk through the commercial districts of major metropolitan areas, and the negative space speaks louder than any official press release. The handwritten signs in shop windows seeking bilingual staff are gone, replaced by notices of reduced operating hours. In municipal housing offices, the long queues of applicants waiting for registration forms have dissipated, not because the demand has ceased, but because the eligibility criteria have been tightened beyond reach. In regional agricultural centers, fields remain unharvested as the seasonal labor supply contracts under the weight of new enforcement mandates. Local business owners speak off the record about a chilling effect. A sudden absence of patronage in neighborhoods that once thrived on the consumption patterns of newly arrived populations. The tables in immigrant-run community spaces sit empty. The logistics firms that specialized in international personal remittances report a sharp, unprecedented drop in transaction volumes. The structural causes of this global reversal are deeply embedded in macroeconomics and state architecture, beginning with a profound crisis of state capacity. For years, states absorbed hundreds of thousands of arrivals annually without scaling their physical infrastructure. In 2026, the mathematics of that neglect have become unmanageable. Consider the situation in Australia, a nation whose modern economy was explicitly designed around high immigration targets. The country is doubling down on a zero-tolerance approach, implementing a structural mandate to reduce unauthorized arrivals by at least 50% within 12 months. The mechanism driving this is a calculated outsourcing of state territory. By expanding offshore detention facilities in Nauru and Papua New Guinea, the state effectively removes asylum processing from its legal jurisdiction, bypassing domestic judicial oversight. In 2025, over 5,000 individuals were held in these offshore zones. In 2026, the state is expanding that capacity by an additional 3,000 beds. This administrative pivot is directly tied to an underlying economic distortion. Australia's unemployment rate has crept upward to 5.2%, a decade-high metric that has forced a political reassessment of public expenditure. The state currently allocates over $3.5 billion annually to immigration enforcement alone. As cost of living indices strain domestic household budgets, the state is systematically prioritizing highly specific skilled labor over general migration pathways. The immediate casualties of this structural triage are temporary visa holders. Renewal approvals have been cut by nearly 30%, converting thousands of active tax-paying workers into individuals facing immediate expiration deadlines. The state projects more than 20,000 total removals this year. Yet, the paradox remains unaddressed. The underlying economy remains structurally dependent on foreign labor to sustain its core industries, setting up an inevitable friction between enforcement mandates and market realities. A parallel structural breakdown is visible in Turkey, a state that functioned for a decade as the primary geopolitical buffer zone between the Middle East and Europe, hosting an estimated 3.7 million Syrian refugees alongside hundreds of thousands of individuals from Afghanistan, Iran, and Iraq. The state apparatus is buckling under economic exhaustion. The administrative target for 2026 is the removal of 600,000 undocumented migrants. The cause is not merely political, it is monetary. Domestic inflation has accelerated to nearly 40%, food security indices are deteriorating, and the national currency has depreciated by more than 35% against the US dollar. With general unemployment exceeding 9%, the presence of a vast informal labor pool has created intense domestic friction. The state's response has transformed the visual landscape of its major cities. In Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, the normal flow of urban life is regularly interrupted by systematic, random identity checkpoints. Undocumented individuals are detained in situ and processed through fast-track deportation pipelines. While the state publicly emphasizes a voluntary return program, particularly for Syrian nationals, institutional data suggests the concept of choice has been effectively removed by the deliberate narrowing of legal protections. Simultaneously, the state is fortifying its physical periphery, leveraging European Union funding to construct miles of border walls and advanced automated surveillance networks. In 2025, authorities intercepted 150,000 unauthorized border crossings. The 2026 enforcement quotas are designed to surpass that metric significantly, treating border security as a matter of existential economic survival, even in regions historically defined by their adherence to liberal human rights frameworks. The structural shift is equally pronounced. Spain, long considered the southern gateway to Europe with a reputation for flexible enforcement, is executing a quiet institutional realignment. The state has set a target of 80,000 deportations for 2026, a metric that represents a 100% increase over the previous year's figures. The strategy here is notable for its lack of public rhetoric. It is a bureaucratic extraction wave occurring away from the international spotlight. The immediate catalyst is a severe maritime crisis in the Canary Islands, where sea arrivals reached an all-time high of 50,000 individuals in 2025, originating primarily from Morocco, Algeria, Mali, and Senegal. To interrupt this supply chain, Spain has bypassed standard, lengthy judicial reviews by signing bilateral repatriation treaties with Morocco and Algeria. These agreements allow for immediate administrative expulsions. Beneath this enforcement surge lies a stagnant domestic labor market, where unemployment persists at 11.8% despite a modest 2.1% GDP growth. The friction has manifested acutely in the housing sector. Authorities have initiated widespread, aggressive inspections of overcrowded municipal housing and informal rental markets, using housing code violations as a primary mechanism to identify, evict, and ultimately deport undocumented populations without triggering the lengthy legal battles associated with standard immigration law. What these distinct national data points reveal is a synchronized departure from the globalized status quo. Whether through the overt militarization of urban spaces or the quiet manipulation of municipal housing codes, the state is reasserting its absolute authority over the individual. The machinery of exclusion is being optimized across different legal systems and geographic realities, driven by a shared realization among governing elites that the old models of unmanaged population movement are no longer structurally sustainable. The baseline has been erased, and the new rules are being written in the language of quotas, biometric tracking, and unappealable deadlines. But as these three nations lay the groundwork for a world defined by containment, deeper and more aggressive iterations of this structural reversal are manifesting elsewhere, driven by vastly different sovereign anxieties. While the administrative targets of the southern European periphery and the Pacific Island networks reveal a clear breakdown in global mobility, this institutional pivot manifests even more aggressively within the world's major demographic and industrial centers. The structural reversal is no longer confined to border outposts or transit choke points. It has penetrated the interior of the world's largest economies, fundamentally altering the calculus of domestic production and citizenship. As states transition from passive management to active expulsion, the legal and economic architecture that once shielded long-term migrant populations is being systematically dismantled. The scale of this shift becomes evident when examining the Indian subcontinent. where the state is executing one of the most statistically significant population repatriations in modern history. For 2026, the state apparatus has formalized a mandate to repatriate at least 250,000 undocumented individuals. This is not a sudden policy shift born of recent electoral cycles, but the climax of a multi-decade demographic friction. Estimates indicate that over 10 million undocumented individuals, primarily from neighboring Bangladesh, have integrated into the informal domestic economy over the past 20 years. The physical reality of this enforcement is defined by infrastructure on a massive scale. Along the eastern border, the state has completed over 4,000 kilometers of physical fencing, reinforced by automated thermal imaging and motion sensing surveillance grids. Simultaneously, the internal legal landscape has been rewritten through rigorous citizenship verification protocols. Rather than targeting new arrivals, the state is auditing established communities. Over 8 million individual residency cases have already undergone administrative review. In border states like Assam and West Bengal, the visual markers of this audit are stark. Document processing centers have replaced local municipal offices, where thousands wait daily to present decades-old land deeds or ancestral certificates. Those whose documentation fails to meet the new evidentiary threshold are stripped of legal status, facing immediate transfer to specialized holding facilities. This domestic tightening is synchronized with international obligations. Under a reciprocal diplomatic framework, India has agreed to repatriate 18,000 of its own undocumented citizens from the United States, demonstrating an alignment with a broader global consensus on migration control that prioritizes state security over humanitarian exemptions. Further west, the Gulf monarchies are executing a different variation of this structural purge, driven not by demographic anxiety but by state-managed economic engineering. Saudi Arabia has initiated an aggressive enforcement campaign targeting the expulsion of over 1.2 million undocumented workers in 2026. This mass removal operates as a critical mechanism of the state's Vision 2030 framework, which seeks to artificially correct a severe labor market distortion. Historically, foreign nationals have comprised nearly 70% of the private sector workforce. To force the entry of its own citizens into the private market, where youth unemployment persists at 11%, the state is systematically eliminating foreign labor competition. The enforcement mechanism is a scorched earth administrative audit of the domestic corporate sector. State inspectors have conducted over 500,000 unannounced workplace audits, resulting in the immediate closure of thousands of commercial enterprises for labor code violations. Corporate entities discovered employing undocumented staff face non-negotiable fines of up to 100,000 Saudi riyals per violation. Walk through the industrial zones on the outskirts of Riyadh or Jeddah, and the sensory evidence of this economic extraction is unmistakable. The sprawling logistics yards and manufacturing plants suffer from a sudden, heavy stillness. The continuous hum of heavy machinery has given way to intermittent operations. Shifts have been consolidated, and half-empty employee transport buses sit idling in vacant parking lots. The economic shockwaves of this enforcement extend far beyond the kingdom's borders. Foreign laborers in Saudi Arabia historically transmitted over $40 billion in annual remittances to developing economies like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. The sudden termination of these financial lifelines is destabilizing regional banking networks, transforming a domestic labor policy into a transnational liquidity crisis in Western Europe. The breakdown of the post-war migration model has reached the core states of the European Union, where the visual and fiscal infrastructure of integration is collapsing. Germany, which positioned itself as the moral and logistical anchor of the 2015 refugee crisis, has increased its deportation quotas by 35% compared to previous baseline years. The systemic cause is a profound exhaustion of municipal capacity. Urban centers like Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich are facing structural deficits in public infrastructure. State-subsidized housing networks and temporary shelters are operating at a non-negotiable 95% capacity. Public sentiment has solidified behind this restriction, with institutional surveys indicating that 62% of the population demands stricter legislative controls. The state has responded by truncating the legal process itself. The number of judicial appeals available to rejected asylum seekers has been reduced by half, allowing the state to execute deportations weeks rather than years after an initial denial. The economic motivation is stark. Germany's GDP growth slowed to a marginal 0.6%, while the fiscal cost of maintaining asylum infrastructure exceeds $20 billion annually. Furthermore, the state is deploying technological solutions to combat widespread administrative evasion. Following reports of over 120,000 cases of documentation fraud in recent asylum cycles, municipal authorities have implemented mandatory biometric verification systems at all points of state contact. The traditional paper-based immigration office has been replaced by secure biometric kiosks, transforming the relationship between the migrant and the host state into an automated process of verification or exclusion. A more radical departure from European legal norms is unfolding in Italy, where the state has pioneered a policy of extraterritorial processing that effectively externalizes its sovereign borders. Rather than allowing maritime arrivals to touch Italian soil, where they would gain protection under European human rights conventions, the state has established a bilateral framework with Albania. Migrants intercepted in international waters are transferred directly to state-funded detention complexes within Albanian territory. If their legal claims are rejected, they are deported directly from the Balkan Peninsula, never having entered the European Union. This policy addresses a severe logistical bottleneck. In 2025, over 150,000 individuals arrived on southern Italian shores, representing a 35% escalation that overwhelmed regional processing centers. The fiscal burden of this influx reached $5.5 billion annually. By outsourcing this infrastructure to a non-EU state, the government projects a 40% reduction in long-term administrative costs. This strategy represents a fundamental shift in the global geometry of migration, the creation of sovereign enclaves outside of sovereign territory, designed specifically to intercept and deflect human mobility before it can interact with domestic legal systems. The empty processing tents in Lampedusa and Sicily stand as physical monuments to this policy shift. The crowds that once defined these transit hubs have been replaced by naval vessels patrolling the horizon. Enforcing a policy of systematic deflection, these regional case studies demonstrate that the global tightening of 2026 is not an emotional reaction to crisis, but a cold, infrastructure-driven optimization of state power. From the biometric kiosks of Germany to the extraterritorial camps of Albania, the modern nation-state is developing highly sophisticated mechanisms to purge surplus labor and unauthorized residents from its interior. The old arguments for global integration are being overridden by the immediate demands of fiscal preservation and demographic control. Every country is refining its tools, closing the legal loopholes that allowed millions to build lives in the shadows of the developed world. Yet, as these nations implement their containment strategies, the ultimate iteration of this structural reversal is converging on the Anglo-American world, where the enforcement apparatus is preparing for an escalation that will redefine the global economic landscape entirely. Behind these macroeconomic equations and systemic re-engineerings lies a deeper visceral reality, the precise point where the structural weight of the state collides with the intimate geography of the human household. When an administrative apparatus optimizes its enforcement mechanics, it does not merely alter fiscal balances, it disrupts the basic rhythm of daily life for families, neighborhoods, and entire industrial sectors. The modern enforcement drive of 2026 is no longer a distant bureaucratic abstraction. It is an immediate physical presence that enters the home through a simple slip of paper, transforming a decades-long life of quiet integration into an urgent countdown toward removal. The manifestation of this human displacement is vividly apparent within the industrial heartlands of France, where the state's mandate to deport over 150,000 individuals has filtered down into the municipal infrastructure of working-class suburbs. Walk through the northern districts of Paris or the manufacturing corridors around Lyon, and the sensory landscape reflects a deep internal retreat. The public squares that once served as communal spaces for immigrant workers are quiet. The local specialty markets report a severe contraction in foot traffic, shelves remain stocked with unpurchased regional goods, and the owners of neighborhood cafes sit alone at empty counters. In these communities, the fear of identity verification checkpoints has altered human behavior down to the hours of movement. Residents who lack formalized documentation have abandoned public transit networks, choosing instead to walk through poorly lit residential side streets to reach their workplaces. Local construction supervisors speak off the record about a sudden, inexplicable absenteeism. Skilled drywallers, bricklayers, and culinary assistants who had missing papers have simply stopped showing up to their shifts. This quiet disappearance is the direct result of a targeted 20% reduction in state-sponsored migrant assistance and welfare programs. The state has transformed the economic landscape from one of precarious survival to one of deliberate material exclusion, forcing families to choose between self-repatriation or a hazardous existence completely detached from the formal grid. Across the English Channel, the human cost of this structural tightening has penetrated even deeper into the social fabric, challenging the very definition of belonging. In the United Kingdom, where the administrative quota demands roughly 410 removals every single day, the enforcement net has widened to ensnare long-term residents who assumed their place in society was permanent. The housing crisis in metropolitan centers like London and Birmingham, where rents escalated by 12% in a single year, has weaponized the domestic rental market against its inhabitants. Under new compliance mandates, private landlords have been converted into auxiliary immigration officers, required to perform exhaustive digital verifications of their tenants' legal status under threat of severe asset penalties. The result is a silent wave of evictions that leaves families displaced without a public record of their removal. In neighborhoods like Brixton or parts of Manchester, the physical artifacts of this displacement sit on the curbside: hastily packed cardboard boxes, discarded children's toys, and small pieces of domestic furniture left behind in the rush of an unexpected lease termination. The most profound psychological fracture is borne by the children of these households, many of whom were born in the United Kingdom, speak only English, and have never seen the ancestral countries of their parents. They return from school to find their homes empty, or their parents packing the few possessions they can carry. The state's 30% reduction in work visa renewals has transformed stable, mortgage-paying households into targets for administrative expulsion, leaving multi-generational families trapped in a legal limbo where decades of tax contributions and community integration are erased by a single, unappealable deportation order. This systemic tragedy reaches its numerical peak within the United States, where the enforcement apparatus is calibrated to execute at least 300,000 deportations this year, a rate of 822 individuals every 24 hours. The human cost of this operation is written into the daily routine of the agricultural valleys of California and the construction corridors of the American Sunbelt. In these regions, the deployment of over 10,000 military personnel to the southern border and a 40% increase in autonomous drone surveillance have been matched internally by a 25% escalation in targeted workplace raids. The impact on local communities is characterized by a profound, paralyzing silence. In the early morning hours, the traditional gatherings of day laborers outside home improvement centers have vanished. The fields of the Central Valley, which rely on immigrant labor to harvest the nation's fresh produce, face a critical manpower deficit. Entire families have entered a state of domestic confinement, refusing to open their doors to anyone without a verified personal connection. The sanctuary status of major cities like Los Angeles and Chicago offers little protection against the specialized field offices of federal enforcement agencies, which have increased their presence around municipal transport hubs and local commercial districts. The human cost here is measured in the quiet conversations held in darkened living rooms, where parents instruct their children on what to do if they fail to return from their shifts. It is visible in the local churches that have seen their congregations thin out, as families avoid public gatherings to minimize the risk of encounter with enforcement vehicles. The economic dependency of the American agricultural and construction sectors on this very workforce creates an institutional paradox. The state is aggressively purging the human capital required to sustain its own supply chains, treating the people who build its infrastructure and harvest its food as statistical anomalies to be extracted and discarded when observed globally. Now, the tightening borders of 2026 reveal a profound and sobering truth about the nature of the modern nation-state. The grand experiments of globalized integration, fluid labor markets, and humanitarian exceptionalism are being dismantled not by a failure of human ambition, but by the cold, unyielding limits of state survival. The international order has arrived at a point where the physical and financial infrastructure of nations can no longer support the demographic movements that their economic systems once demanded. The response is a universal retreat behind physical walls, biometric databases, and automated exclusion pipelines. The closing image of this global era is not one of violent conflict at the perimeter, but of a quiet administrative finality. It is found in the thousands of small identical enforcement letters sitting on kitchen tables from Sydney to Berlin, from Paris to Los Angeles. Each letter represents the absolute reassertion of sovereign authority over the trajectory of a human life. As the evening light fades across these suburban landscapes, the windows of immigrant neighborhoods darken early, reflecting a world that has chosen containment over community and exclusion over integration. The great migration networks that built the modern world are being systematically closed down, leaving millions of individuals to face the reality that their time in the